Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of
Holy
God and our Mother, pray for us sinners
sinners.
now and at the hour of our death. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Welcome back to Fireside with Fathers, everybody. It's great to be back after a little stint there. Don't forget to subscribe, especially if you're new to the channel. It's a way of evangelizing and also getting Google to evangelize, because more subscriptions, more activity, the more it gets out there. So if you feel in your heart, you want someone to hear this, or if there's other stuff on the channel that could help somebody, get it out there and get other people to subscribe. So tonight we got Father Jeff Langan again with us. It's great to have you as always, Father, especially for tonight's topic, because I think you could have a lot of insight for all of us, because obviously Afghanistan has been on the news for a while now, and I think a lot of people maybe would just be following mainstream stuff, especially here in Ireland. There's just really one outlet of news. So, I mean, you're just seeing like Joe Biden's blunders and Americans dying, people not being able to get on planes, and just, that's basically probably all they're going to be getting. But I think there's a bit more to Afghanistan, and there's a lot more that was building up to it. And I think it has a lot to do with what we're living now. It has a lot more importance. So what's the deal with Afghanistan? What's going on?
Well, it can be a challenge to know exactly where to start. But I think the more immediate way of putting this together would be to say, well, what are we doing? What's been the plan the last 2 to 5 years for Afghanistan? We all know, everyone knows, at least in general, that we began the war against Afghanistan after 9/11. And there are students today who are freshmen in college, and their whole life has been the war in Afghanistan. Not that it's overtaken their lives, but it's certainly been going on. And one of the things that brought Donald Trump to office in 2016 was this idea of America first. And without getting into the nitty-gritty of that, I think one aspect of that message and also without getting into the personality conflicts and all sorts of other things, but there was one aspect of that message that resonated with a large swath of American people. And that was the idea that we've been fighting this war in Afghanistan or Iraq. We've been fighting them for too long. There's no end in sight. It's not clear why we're there anymore. It may not even be clear why we ever went there in the first place. And so one of the things that began actually in 2016 is that the American foreign policy establishment, or the diplomatic corps, under, I don't know, I can't say exactly who, but basically the American establishment began to say, let's work with the Pakistanis, let's work with the Indians, the Chinese, the Russians, even the Iranians, and in this particular instance, beginning in 2016, it was actually the Pakistani intelligence services that took the lead in establishing contacts with the Taliban, with the idea of essentially handing the country over to them. And the American withdrawal from Afghanistan has been something that's been in the works behind the scenes going back to 2016. Now, the Taliban are really a series of tribes within Afghanistan, and they have a strong ethnic identity. They also have a strong religious identity. But they're not the only ethnic tribes in Afghanistan, but they are the most numerous and they are the most powerful. And they do have ties to Pakistan. They do have ties to ethnically to Pakistanis. And so the Pakistanis were actually the ones given the lead in really going tribe by tribe. And also, these mountain tribes also have a fairly complicated or non-modern way of dealing with each other, giving respect for guests, for example, giving hospitality to visitors. If you dial back to 2001, 2002, when the United States first made the charge that it was Osama bin Laden that directed the 9/11 attacks, the leader of Afghanistan at the time, he actually said, if you can give us any evidence that he was involved in directing or coordinating these attacks, we will hand him over to you. And we never actually came forth with that evidence, so obviously he was never handed over to us. But they do have certain codes, right? They have codes of hospitality, codes of justice. And from 2016 until the present, we used, or the intelligence services in the countries around Afghanistan essentially used that very tribal, ethnic way of working in order to work for the gradual takeover of the country, that by which Americans could kind of leave the country. Now, of course, one of the reasons we're in Afghanistan in the first place, and one of the reasons, for example, that the EU would be interested in Afghanistan, is that Afghanistan presents a political, there's a political rationale for being there, and then there's also a business rationale for being there. The political rationale is that Afghanistan borders all these countries in the eastern world: Russia, China, Iran, India, Pakistan. They all have a vested interest in Afghanistan. And also, historically, right, from a kind of Machiavellian political standpoint, Afghanistan could be used against these countries, or tribes within Afghanistan could be used against these countries. From a business standpoint, everybody, especially now, everybody is interested in Afghani lithium, right? Because lithium runs batteries. And that's going to be very important in the next 40 or 50 years for cars and whatnot. Now, there's another element of Afghanistan that's very interesting. Maybe interesting is not the best word, but there's another element of Afghanistan, which is, well, Afghanistan also provides opium or heroin, the poppy fields, right? And I know a soldier who spent time protecting poppy fields. And this can be very important for pharmaceuticals. It can also be very important for the drug trade, which is lucrative for money off the books, especially for Western intelligence services. So the EU, one of the things I've discovered in looking into Afghanistan is that this is one of those areas where you can say the EU has a foreign policy. And if I could draw an analogy about EU foreign policy, at least for the American audience, I would draw the analogy to the Quakers. Right? The Quakers in colonial times were pacifists. They didn't fight wars. So what did they do? They would hire mercenaries, or they would get proxies to fight their wars for them. And the EU has a little bit of that approach in the world, right? The EU wants absolute peace within the European borders, within what's called the EU. And they actually, I think, benefit from a little bit of instability in other parts of the world. Why? Because instability gives them a chance to come in and to make contracts. And so part of the rationale, so part of what's been going on, I think, a little bit in Afghanistan in these last couple months is that obviously, I don't want to get bogged down in discussions of the ins and outs of how the withdrawal was done. I know a fellow who's a very wealthy fellow who actually has used his private jet to fly women and children out of Afghanistan in the last month or so. But I think from the wider political international relations standpoint, it's clear at some point the withdrawal had to come. I think the hope of the countries that were involved in these negotiations, especially with the Chinese and the Pakistani and the Taliban, that there would be some sort of from the business standpoint, there would be some sort of handover of the government to the Taliban. The Taliban, in the case of the Chinese, I think the Chinese were hoping that the Taliban would kind of rein in any radical Muslims that might exist within China itself, or that they would work with the Chinese in doing that. I think the hope was that the Taliban would give a kind of access to these lithium mines to really maybe to the Chinese, but also to the EU, also to the United States. One of the interesting things about the Taliban is that in the 1990s, so I think at this point, if we could just kind of sum up a little bit of what's been happening just the last month or so in Afghanistan, it would be this. Through the Pakistanis, the EU and the United States have been working with the Taliban so that they could take control of the country. The Chinese have also been involved, and the Russians and the Indians and the Iranians. The danger right now is that while this has been going on, we've also seen introduced into Afghanistan once again radical Muslims who may or may not be in agreement with the Taliban. So we've seen the rise of this mysterious ISIS-K, right? The bombing that took place at the airport that killed 13 American soldiers, that's getting a lot of play here in the United States, right? That bombing was actually carried out by ISIS-K, not by the Taliban. And it's not clear that the Taliban and, for example, and ISIS-K they're not the same entity. And it's also not clear that the Taliban and Al-Qaeda are the same entity. Though often in the news, it's not clear whether these three things are the same or different.
Yeah.
There is a real danger right now in Afghanistan that these Muslim, these ISIS-K and Al-Qaeda or other groups, that they actually do instigate a kind of civil war within Afghanistan. It's also a danger that the Taliban they might stop working with the Chinese, right? It's not clear who is ultimately going to have control of these lithium mines, and whoever gets control of these lithium mines, to what degree they're going to work with China, Russia, the EU, or the United States. One thing also that's not clear is what's going to happen to the poppy fields, right? And that's where I think in all of these things, we need to start to take a step back into history to understand at least the history of it, for helping us to understand what might happen now or what might happen next. So you take, for example, the poppy fields. Well, let's just go back. Let's go back to the 1970s. Okay. And during the reign of Jimmy Carter, during the administration of Jimmy Carter, Afghanistan was perceived as being this country between China and Russia. And one of the advisors of Jimmy Carter was Brzezinski. And Brzezinski had accepted the Mckinder Thesis. And in order to understand the Mckinder Thesis, Mckinder was a geologist from the early 20th century back in England. And he was tasked with coming up with a way of thinking about the world that might help, in this case, the United Kingdom, the British Empire, to continue to spread its power or to keep its power throughout the world. And Mckinder, before he became a geologist, he was trained as a classicist. Mckinder had read through Thucydides, the history of the Peloponnesian War. And he said, well, basically in the Peloponnesian War, you had Sparta being the land empire. And then you had Athens and her allies being the sea empire. And Athens and her allies, as the sea empire, they essentially tried to organize the world economically. And also, they tried to maintain the dominance of the seas as a way of making sure that all of the land empires and all the other cities would be dependent upon Athens. And so Mckinder said, well, you could take that basic schema of the Peloponnesian War and you could apply it to the world. And in the case of the world, the sea, the Athenian, the world equivalent of the Athenian Empire would be the island states. It would be the United Kingdom, the United States. At the time, he thought South Africa, Australia, New Zealand. He also thought Japan, right? They would be the periphery, the island empire. And then the modern version of Sparta would be some combination of Germany, Russia, and China. And so people like Brzezinski, they thought that, well, the whole goal is to prevent any kind of a union between, for Brzezinski, it was any kind of a union between Russia and China. And also, the next step would be, is there a way to, over time, break up Russia and China into many, many different pieces? So Brzezinski's big goal by the late 1970s, because Nixon's foreign policy had driven a wedge between China and Russia at the time, between the Soviet Union and then communist China. So Kissinger, Nixon's foreign policy had driven kind of a wedge between those two nations. And Brzezinski was dedicated to, well, is there a way that we can start to weaken the Soviet Union, and maybe later on the Chinese? So this is a little known fact that I think many people forget, is that Brzezinski, during the Carter administration, he helped create Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan.
Wow.
Right? He helped to Osama bin Laden, the people that started Al-Qaeda. He got them into Afghanistan even before the Soviets had played some sort of role in gaining control of the Afghani government. Brzezinski, and you can read this in an article which is now on the Corbett Report. It just came out. It came out this weekend after I had sent you some of the materials for this show. But the Corbett Report, he does a study on Al-Qaeda and its history, and he quotes Brzezinski, papers from Brzezinski from before the Soviets even went into Afghanistan in 1979, basically saying, we're going to put Al-Qaeda there as a way of luring the Russians in. We're going to do this to bleed. We want to bleed the Russians in a kind of Vietnam, which will once and for all put an end. It'll economically put an end to the Soviet Union. So Al-Qaeda gets into from Pakistan, it gets into Afghanistan in the late 1970s. And then it becomes very important in bleeding the Russians in Afghanistan in the 1980s. Corbett, in his report on Al-Qaeda, on the history of Al-Qaeda, he makes it pretty clear that the way that primarily the United States helped Al-Qaeda in the 1980s was not so much through finances, because the bin Laden, through his family, he had enough money to support the various warriors that they were bringing in from the Muslim world to Afghanistan in the 1980s. But what they did do is they did help through, like, there's an infamous story of a fellow named Ali Mohammed. It's an incredible story. He actually ended up being in the Marines for quite some time. And then from the Marines goes to Afghanistan to help fight against the Soviet Union. And we all know the story of the Soviet Union, how it falls by the end of the 1980s. I guess the point would be is that, yes, our intelligence services, they were collaborating with Al-Qaeda in the 1980s in Afghanistan. Not so much financially as probably through facilitating movement in the world through our consulates. And if anybody wants to look at this further, you can look at the article on the Corbett Report. So I have a friend actually who grew up in Afghanistan in the 1950s. He was a Christian mission. His parents were Christian missionaries there. And in the 1990s, after he's a man of means. He can invest in nations. Well, in the 1990s, he went to Afghanistan. And he tried to identify men of character. And he worked with the Taliban basically to put an end to the poppy fields, to put an end to Afghanistan as the country that produced heroin. And in the days leading up to 9/11 in 2001, now this guy, everywhere this guy goes, he spends several years trying to identify men of character who can be reliable, who can be relied upon to act according to some notion of justice or principle whenever they're acting in political or economic life. This guy's friends were all assassinated leading up to 9/11. And they weren't just assassinated by locals, if I could put it that way. And again, if anybody was interested, I could lead you to some documentation on that. But what's interesting about the Taliban is that before 9/11, leading in one, they had basically put an end to the poppy fields. After 9/11, the poppy fields all come back. And Afghanistan becomes a production of heroin, or a source of heroin in the world. Right? So this is one of the, and then there's a woman who worked as an accountant in the Bush administration, and Catherine Austin Fitts is her name, and she's done a number of papers and interviews. She's basically showing that if you look at our GDP, if you look at our budget, these last 15 to 20 years, there are trillions of dollars unaccounted for. And her point is, we have to be getting this money from somewhere. And this is a most likely place.
Would it be the heroin?
Yeah, the heroin trade. My friend, I have another friend who he claims to be at the level of these discussions, and he says it's definitely the heroin trade. My other friend who worked in military intelligence in Afghanistan, he was there helping to protect the poppy fields. Right? And everyone.
So it seems like so far, just basically what I'm getting is that Afghanistan is a gold mine. As far as business goes, you're getting lithium, heroin. As far as politics, you would consider, would the states be like Athens, and like they would want basically Russia and China to be broken up and no threat of them uniting, which Afghanistan could be a unity between them.
Right. Right. So if you look, there's going back to the Byzantine Empire, there's a way of doing foreign policy. I mean, I'm sure it's not just, I don't want to pick on the Byzantine Empire, right? But you can see it just to give another example, right? You can see that there is one way of doing foreign policy is to withdraw from a nation. It's to not try to govern it militarily or run its government, but you withdraw from it, and you actually lead it into chaos. You want chaotic groups to be there. You want the state to collapse. Why? Because when the state collapses, it's easier to extract the natural resources. I'm saying that's a theory, and I think that's a theory you can see in practice in various places in the world. It's completely unjust. It's completely Machiavellian. But you could see that there could be some elements in foreign policy establishments right now that could still maintain this heartland theory of the world. And you could see how they would argue, yeah, we'll pull out of Afghanistan. And what we'll do is we'll go back to funding these radical groups. These radical groups will become our proxies. They'll keep the state destabilized, and we'll be able to somehow work around them in order to extract the natural resources that we want to extract from the country. In a way, it's cheaper than trying to keep the military there. If you look at, for example, what's happened, I mean, Lebanon is on the verge of being a failed state. Syria was almost a failed state, except for the fact the Russians intervened. Iraq is almost a failed state. Somalia is a failed state. Yemen is a failed state. Right? There's an active political philosophy out there that seems very comfortable with bringing about failed states. In Europe itself, Ukraine at this point is almost a failed state.
When you say failed state, is that just what you're saying? Like it's been destabilized. There's no structure. There's no unity. They're not strong like in their government. It's just basically falling apart.
Yeah, what I mean is that the government is essentially falling apart. It's so weak that it can't regulate business. It can't regulate the economy in such a way that normal business can take place. Venezuela at this point is close to being a failed
Yeah, I was
state,
gonna say.
right? And this allows criminal groups. This allows criminal groups, gangs, radical groups to exert more influence than their numbers would suggest. You could go back to this fellow Corbett puts in the little article that he wrote for this weekend. It's also a video, but he quotes an advisor for the British Empire going back to in the 18th, 19th century, saying, "We want to have an influence in writing the Hindu textbooks." Because why? If we have an influence in writing the Hindu textbooks, we can basically tell a story which will create divisions between Hindus and Muslims, will create more radical Hindu and Muslim groups that'll be at animosity with each other. And that'll be some sort of a benefit for how we govern the empire. Brzezinski also sensed, right, that if you can get a radical group in Afghanistan, once Afghanistan becomes somewhat stabilized, you can then redirect these radical groups. So, for example, many of the Al-Qaeda fighters in the 1990s ended up going from Afghanistan into Chechnya to fight in the Chechen wars against the Russians at that point in the 1990s. A kind of cynical view of, well, why is ISIS now started in Afghanistan? Well, ISIS has started in Afghanistan precisely to prevent the Taliban from forming a government. And perhaps at some point, ISIS in Afghanistan, if this theory were true, ISIS in Afghanistan could unite with radical Muslims in China, right, to help stir up trouble there, to weaken, in a sense, to cause problems for the Chinese.
So is the United States, like, as far as, I mean, I think at this stage it's pretty clear that it is like, the empire, and our foreign policy has been to expand or collapse. And you said, like, Trump was trying to basically focus on just the homeland. Would you say that it's on a decline now? Are these signs that it's declining, or is it just, like you said, pulling out maybe to get, as a tactic to get stronger?
Yeah, that's the question. I think that's the big question. So I think to start to answer this question, we should say something about this document. It's called the Project for a New American Century. This was a document written in the late 1990s. I think it's 1997 or 98. It was written by the foreign policy group that we call the neoconservatives. And the whole point of the document was to try to envision American foreign policy going into the next century, the next 100 years. And one of the interesting things in the document, for example, was that the overarching goal of the document would be this. If you were to look at the world as king of the hill, America is the king of the hill. America is the singular superpower at this point. And so what America should do is America should do everything in its power to keep its status as singular superpower. And this document considered the fact that in the Cold War, it was somewhat easy to keep our status and to grow the empire. Why? Because we had the enemy of the communist Soviet Union. But once the Cold War ends, you don't have an enemy. You don't have an easy enemy anymore. So actually, they say in this document, it might take some Pearl Harbor-like event in order for us to justify the kind of activity that we need to justify in order to keep America's dominance throughout the world. Also say, by the way, they also say at one point, we should also consider, again, I'm paraphrasing, this isn't an exact quote, we should also consider the use of bioterror, viruses, biological warfare, and other possibilities that could present for keeping a certain dominance in the world.
When was that written again, Father Jeff?
So 1997 or 98.
And if someone wanted to find that, what would
I had a friend,
they type in, just for anybody who might want to catch that if they didn't get it?
I would just say type in Project for a New American Century PDF. I sent you a link to it. But I would just type in Project for New American Century PDF. That'd be very easy to find that way. I had a friend who, right around the time that was written, also, it was right around the time when the United States, when we were involved in the whole Kosovo, Bosnia, Serbia affairs in the late 90s, and at some point we bombed Serbia. And I had a friend who was an old political scientist, political philosopher, and he wrote us a missive right around that time. And he said, throughout my whole life, this guy was a very mild-mannered gentleman. He said, throughout my whole life, there's been this debate going on about whether well, clearly, with the bombing of Serbia that we've done in Kosovo, from being a republic to an empire. Whether we crossed it before or not, we don't need to answer that question. But clearly at this point, we're an empire, because empires fight wars that are unjust, wars of aggression, wars that have no real meaning as far as being defensive, just wars. So and this is very important, I think, for Catholic social teaching, right? One of the features of a just war is that it is defensive in nature. There is an imminent threat, and this imminent threat, you are warding off the enemy from committing, and also you're not doing it for any reason for expanding your power. And so this fellow said clearly after this war, now the United States is trying to maintain some sort of univocal empire throughout the world. And by the way, I have an interesting anecdote, if I could give a little anecdote here, that took place around 9/11, which is relevant to this discussion. So my first semester as a teacher was fall semester 2001. And I was teaching this class on authority. And the first week of the class, we had this discussion on just war theory. And the class was about 12 to 15 students. Most of them, because they had been inculcated in the modern university, they were completely liberal. They were liberalized, which is what, the modern university is there as kind of a propaganda organ for certain liberal factions, right? So they were completely liberal. And so when we were talking about just war theory at the very beginning, before 9/11, the leaders of the class clearly, and then everyone else kind of tends to follow the leaders, they were all like vociferous, critical of just war teaching. They were saying we should just be pacifists. There's never an occasion for fighting a war. We should just be, opposing all war. And then there was this one fellow from Baltimore. He said, I understand this pacifist desire, right? This makes sense to me, right? We shouldn't fight wars. But the war power is kind of like the police power. If there are bad guys, if there are criminal organizations out there, and they're doing harm to the population, you have to go and stop them, right? And so what's the case in the local community should also be the case in the international community. And actually, I don't know if this guy had even ever read Aquinas, but that's essentially what Aquinas says about just war. It's the police power applied to the international community. So 9/11 happens. It's a dramatic event. I think 9/11, for me, I remember growing up, people talking about the assassination of JFK. Like they knew where they were the day that they heard the news. I think 9/11 was that event. It was the first event since JFK, as far as that goes, as far as the United States as a whole. So anyway, 9/11 happens. I let 3 or 4 weeks go by. We get into October. Now by October, the propaganda is gearing up. The propaganda is gearing up for the invasion of Afghanistan. And then they're also starting to lay the groundwork for what will become the invasion of Iraq. So I say to the class once again, I say, well, let's reconsider now this just war theory. The very same leaders who were pacifists before 9/11 were now saying, we have to go to Afghanistan, we have to bomb the country, we have to completely change the government, we have to completely alter everything to never let anything like this happen again. And then the one guy from Baltimore, right? The one guy from Baltimore says, I think that if there are criminals who carried out these attacks, and if it's an organized network of criminals that carried out the attacks, I think we should go and we should arrest them. Yes. I mean, we have wonderful secret forces. I mean, we have wonderful special forces. Our special forces could probably go in there and take out the criminal network. But we shouldn't punish an entire nation or two nations for the crimes of a group of people, of one group of people. I think now in retrospect, now that we know more, we can even say that, well, we shouldn't punish the Taliban and all of Afghanistan for the crimes of Al-Qaeda, the group that we created. I didn't know that at the time. I mean, I wasn't that knowledgeable at the time. But I think one interesting thing about Catholic social teaching, and especially just war theory, is that unfortunately, many Catholic thinkers in this country after 9/11 began to say it's time to abandon just war theory. It's time now to go in and to fight aggressive, positive wars, changing nations. And really the only people I can think of there were a few, I think there were a few, they were perceived at the time as like right-wing nut jobs. There were a few so-called conservative Catholics that said, well, maybe this is not prudent to go and do this nation changing. And then there were some progressives. But what's interesting is that what happened after 9/11 in the American landscape is that you got this union of the left and the right all together, right? On the left, you could say the Democratic Party led by, let's say, the Hillary Clinton faction by that point. And on the right, of course, would be the George Bush faction and that whole crowd. Right. So the 9/11 event did bring about, and then also who helps to get the United States into war in these places? It's Tony Blair. I mean, it was the leader of England. Right. And of course, we were able to invoke NATO and get the EU to go along with it. Now, I have a friend who's a little bit cynical about the EU, and he says, well, the EU went along with this knowing that if this could be the event that could start to bleed and lead to the end of the American empire, right? That they had a little bit of a longer vision on it. And so again, they allow in a kind of passive way, they allow the United States to take the lead. They allow the United States to overstep itself. They allow the United States to create chaos out there so that in a way the EU can kind of look like the good guy. And then also they allow the United States, they allow the empire to slowly kind of break down. So there's another vision of how the world could work. There's, I don't want to say there's only one other vision, but one potential other vision of how the world could work could be what we see happening in Afghanistan. That the countries that are closest to the country involved that's problematic, if you want to call it problematic or that has instability, those are the countries that work with that country in order to bring about a certain stability. And in that vision of the world, you wouldn't have the America superpower of the unique power of the world with full spectrum dominance over the entire world. You would have, regional powers that are trying to build up the international order according to some notion of there being a principled international law which could be in conformity with the natural law.
Yeah, but I guess then you wouldn't have lithium or heroin coming in, and then
Right, exactly.
I'd say, like, I mean, at the end of the day, really, who's making the calls, who's governing, these Pearl Harbor events as well that are happening to spark, international
Right.
police forces, us going over there. It all does raise the question at the end of the day that, I think it is all founded on, it has to be founded on greed. I think I had to leave the States really just to get my eyes opened a bit to it, and just to find out that we are involved in wars that I didn't even know existed, and causing little factions in no-name countries, selling weapons, prostitutes to trade, like you said, the resources, South America, Africa, really, I think it's just been going on for ages now. And I mean, I thought maybe 4 years ago it was going to be something that we are going to start pulling out of. But then at the end of the day, like, who's controlling that? Like, if you see
Right.
money falling
Well,
out and the empire going down.
one of the one of the things that growing up, I was completely unaware of. I mean, I can just say until I think I was completely unaware of this. I think I was aware of it on some level in graduate school because you start to read these things in the classics of political philosophy. But I really didn't really start to think this through. And now I think now I know some people who are in these circles, so now I can say it's a fact. We can never. I think what you're pointing towards, which is a huge fact of life, going back to the ancient world, is the role of plutocratic or oligarchic organizations in trying to control political and economic life.
Would
And
would plutocratic that just be the rule of the wealthy, or the?
it's the rule of the wealthy who more often than not are also the few. I mean, Aristotle says you could envision hypothetically some sort of regime where a few poor people have power, but that's usually not. I mean, it's really hard to conceive of that, you know. And going back, I think going back to the ancient world, there's a link I sent you to it's a 3 volume work, but the third volume, it's Werner Jaeger's Paideia. In the third volume, he lays out the conflict between, on the one side, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle; on the other side, the sophists of the ancient world. And one of the things he points out, and you can see if you study the Republic carefully, or if you study even Thucydides, the history of the Peloponnesian War carefully, one of the things that becomes very clear or I don't want to say very clear, but it comes out, is that the sophists were essentially operating. They were the representatives of the oligarchs or the plutocrats of the ancient world. And the ideal government for an oligarch or a plutocrat is a government that appears to be a government based on self representation, a government that is some sort of an appearance of a democracy or a republic, right? That oligarchs want that, so that everybody feels like they're invested in it, everybody feels like they're involved in it. And then the best thing for them is to rule from behind the scenes. In 2001, if someone were to say there's a Bilderberg organization, and that organization is having some influence on American foreign policy, that person would be derided as a conspiracy theorist and run out of polite company. Well, I now know someone who's part of Bilderberg, right? Now you can mention that. Now there are articles in the newspaper, even in the imperial newspapers, right, about the existence of Bilderberg. I know someone that's trying to get into Bilderberg, and he can't, and he's frustrated. He's a frustrated oligarch, right? Things like the World Economic Forum. In the year 2000, only crazy conspiracy theorists would admit that these groups exist and that they have any kind of influence in what happens in the world. But I think now you can at least mention these groups in polite company. And I think it's clear that these groups, when they meet to talk about how they want to shape the economy, how they want to shape the future, how they want to shape the political institutions of nations. Okay, so one of the great threats of our own time, there was this one of the interviews that I sent you. I think it's really worth watching on this topic that we're dealing with today. Is Mark Crispin Miller and Whitney Webb discussing propaganda around 9/11 leading up to the present. And one of the things that Mark Crispin Miller points out is that he thinks that two of the great contributions of the last 400 years is we really do value self-government. We value Republican institutions where the people can vote and their votes have some sort of indirect influence on policy. The other great thing that comes out of according to Mark Crispin Miller, the other great thing that comes out of the last 400 years is a real appreciation for science. And Mark, who describes himself as a progressive leftist, he says those things, those two great achievements in our own time, they're being cast to the wind. They're being thrown aside. And he can't help but draw to the conclusion it's precisely because of these institutions that are oligarchic institutions operating behind the scenes that are determining economic and foreign policy of nations. Why? Because they have more money. They have more money at their disposal than even many large nations, let alone small nations. And you can use money as leverage to influence policy. Right? This is, when I was growing up, the only people that said stuff like this were, I remember reading these textbooks in college of, the danger of, right, the danger of private institutions. They would always tell me something like that. And I remember they were always written by these crazy leftists. Well, I think now on this point, these crazy leftists had a point. The problem is, oftentimes these crazy leftists, at least the ones that I was reading when I was growing up, they were always using, and I think I can explain this one now too, but they were always using the danger of private institutions basically to say the church has too much power in society, right? Down with the church. We need to somehow decrease the power of the church. I actually think now that it's actually a strong church and a strong government that keeps oligarchs in check. And I think you can look at the United States, you could look at Ireland, you could look at the European experience in the 19th century. And if you understand that, what you see happening oftentimes under the guise of liberalism is you see oligarchs doing everything that they can do, first to cut out the power of the church, and then to cut down the power of government so that the oligarchs then can control.
Wow. So, if that being all said, basically, there's actually, you did open up a topic that I would love to get into, but I don't know if we'd probably have to go on for another half an hour. But basically, just what we're going through now, like with the Great Reset and what the World Economic Forum has in mind, and what we're living and how we're seeing so many changes in such short time. It's almost like they have a goal of like a certain, almost even like time period that they want to get to and have all this change come in. I don't know if could you tie that in, or is that too much? Are we opening up something?
I remember once watching this film, Megamind. Was it Megamind? No, it was one of the Marvel comics. The raccoon guy in Guardians of the Galaxy. Mm-hmm. He gets the gun at some point, and he says, "Oh yeah." Maybe this could be our next conversation.
It could be.
But no, you can read. There's the book, The Great Reset. You can go to the World Economic Forum website. You can read stuff that these guys have been printing, have been publishing. And there are, I would recommend, for example, Whitney Webb. She's a great journalist. Mark Crispin Miller himself. There are others. James Corbett, I think, he has done a great job here as well. These journalists have already read and laid out what are the plans of the Great Reset. And I think there is a plan of trying to control the economy, trying to control the size of families, trying to control your range of motion in life, where you could travel, uh, trying to reset the economy. And already in these last 2 years, there's been in the first 20 years of this century, there was a huge transfer of wealth from the middle class to the oligarchic class, and that transfer of wealth has only quickened in these last 2 years. And I think Mark Crispin Miller is right that there is a kind of plan for ending representative government. There is a plan for basically making representative government insignificant, just a blip on the screen, because it's seen as an obstacle to creating this new world order. And every once in a while, you'll see a politician give, even this weekend in Australia, one of the Australian ministers was talking about certain policies they're trying to implement, which we can't name on YouTube. And the minister said, you all have to go along with this because it's part of becoming a legitimate member of the New World Order. I mean, she just said it kind of outright. I don't know if she was trolling the Australian population or if she's just trying to, in her own way, make fun of certain people. But you can see it's there. You can see it's there. And they have all sorts of ideas, which, yeah, they have all sorts of ideas which are going to potentially transform food production, the way people eat, the way we socialize, where we live, the size of our families. I mean, many of these oligarchs, they're perfectly on board with birth control, reducing the size of families, even eliminating families. I think part of the transgender movement, right, not people who suffer from these maladies, but part of the movement is precisely to give as many people as possible ideas of their future life without marriage and family, where they're seeking what satisfies them in something that has really no relationship to a family, a family which would bring them happiness. I think you can see this in a number of their documents. I also think they've made incredible use of the political philosophy of Michel Foucault, whose philosophy has been promoted, especially among the ruling elites in the United States. And I think from the United States in the last 2 years throughout the world, in the forms of what we're now calling critical race theory, but also the transgender movement and whatnot. But I think all that could be part of a much larger discussion.
Oh, I think so as well. And I think a lot of people are actually wondering about that and just getting a bit of, like I said, an alternative and another voice on that, because it is important. And I think we just see it coming. It's unfolding before our eyes. And I think if you were to talk about this 2 years ago, it would have seemed a bit over the top and a bit maybe, I don't know, a bit too much. But I think we're just...
I remember when I was in New York in 2016, 2017, I got invited to a couple events at the UN, to meet the Vatican delegation there and meet some people. And that's precisely when they were pushing through. They were starting to talk already at that time about Agenda 2030. And it seemed at the time like just an innocuous thing, but
Wow.
But now Agenda 2030, that's the goal of the Great Reset. That's what they're working for.
Wow.
Yeah, and of course, 2 years ago, you would just say, "Oh, it's just another UN document."
Well, it's going fast. Let's see if we can get a couple questions maybe up in the, and we'll see where. This is from Dearmid. What does he think is the biggest geopolitical threat to the West over the next 10 years? This is for you, Father.
George Soros. I don't mean to laugh and answer that way, but I think we are our own biggest geopolitical threat in the next 10 years. I think that, how can I put this? Oftentimes people will have these debates, right? Is China the biggest threat? Is Russia the biggest threat? And the United States at this point has over 600 bases throughout the world. We have a huge percentage of our federal budget, which never gets questioned, dedicated to maintaining these bases around the world. So to say that something is a threat to the United States is actually, I think, like an actual military threat. I think we talked about this. We talked about this in the spring. I think the Russians, with their missile system, they do pose a kind of threat to our capacity to destabilize Russia. I think the Chinese government, you could say China. Some other people are sounding. There's a big effort right now to build up China as a threat. China is a threat only in the sense of they're trying to promote business throughout the world. And they're trying to obviously fend off some of our efforts. I think the real threat that comes to the West in the next 10 years is not as much from China as it is to the chaos and the instability that could come to the West because of what we're doing in the world, or because what our oligarchs are doing throughout the world. When we destabilize nations, that's what leads to refugees coming into our countries that we may or may not be able to actually absorb, and we may or may not be able to assimilate. And that actually, I think, is a bigger threat to the stability of our countries than anything China or Russia might do to us.
Okay, and this is from Patricia. Links to Dearman's comment. Once we touch on the greatest threat, what do we do to counter it? Are we doing enough?
So I'm actually heartened these last several weeks by all the protests that have been going on around the world, by seeing citizens resisting and resisting these efforts, which are coming from what I would consider to be oligarchic institutions, to impose a kind of regime on Western nations that, if these were actually ever subject to a vote, I could not see Western nations going along with these kind of repressive measures, right? And I've been somewhat heartened by the peaceful protests that are taking place around the world. I was very heartened these past 2 weekends. Not that I watched any football games, but just seeing the number of football stadiums packed with students, packed, no social distancing, arm in arm, cheering on their team, having a great time. But also we're seeing in the United States, not in every state, but we're seeing citizen groups who are genuinely, from what I can tell, they're genuinely grassroots. They're establishing lines of communication outside of the accepted channels, and they're organizing, and they're coming up with ways to go to school boards. They're coming up with ways to go to local councils. They're coming up with ways, basically, they're putting pressure on local politicians. And perhaps local politicians are the last people we can influence, because they're the last ones. A local politician knows more so than a national politician. If there's enough people here that I upset, no amount of money in the world is going to get me reelected. Right? I have to. If there's enough people that are, that want to exercise their rights as citizens, I have to at least somehow figure out how to go along with them. So I think this is kind of a moment. Alexis de Tocqueville said that one of the dangers of a modern republican government is that the people would get so accustomed just to nonchalantly voting and then returning to their comfortable lives. Because in modern liberal republican societies, it's very easy for a person to create within his own sphere a kind of comfortable life. And I think what's happening in these last 2 or 3 years, which could be a very healthy development, is that people are starting to realize I have to be more involved in my local political institutions. And I think that's one thing we're seeing it happen. I'm going to give a talk tonight here with a group of students that I think you could have never gathered together 50 students of this kind in 2015, who are essentially saying we have to prepare ourselves to go work in the administration, in the government on some level. We have to go into public and social life, because if we don't, free society, Republican government is over. I think 6 years ago you could have never gotten that many students together for this kind of a talk. Like, how do you form yourself to get involved in social and political life? That, I think, was one of the deficiencies of, I know it was one of the deficiencies of the previous generation, or the previous administration in our country, that the person who got into power was unable to find people who had just the modicum of experience that could be appointed to positions of political responsibility, to carry out a policy that was in conformity with what he was voted into office to do. Right? And now I think what we're seeing is there are young people, and they're trying to train themselves to become politically savvy. And one way you do that is just by starting to participate and starting to express your opinion, and then talking with other people.
Yeah. Well, look, we did open up a lot of things there, just with the questions, which kind of inspires me. If you guys do have more questions, and after you watch this, or if you watch it later, just leave them down in the comments. And who knows, maybe we could do even just a session of questions, because there are some good ones, and that could even just spark conversation in itself. So who knows, Father? Maybe we have something there, and then the Great Reset opens up a whole nother thing as well. So, and I think it is all extremely relevant.
One other thing I want to say.
Mm-hmm.
The oligarchs love to work in secret. Right? Going back to the ancient world, they love to work behind the scenes. So the more people do research into who they are and where they operate and what they're saying and what they're doing, right? That brings them out into the open. And in a sense, they may have, in these last couple of years, they themselves may have overplayed their hand by coming out into the open the way they have. Right? But the more that's done to bring them out into the open, the more that makes them want to go back into secret.
Well, praise God. We know He's in charge of history anyways. So I guess on a personal level, we all have to be united to Him in a personal prayer life every day, because if not, you do get caught up, and then at the end of the day, it's not a good road to go down just to get caught up in that. You need to get caught up in God and the role He has in your life. So hopefully we'll be faithful to that. Thank you, Father, once again. If you want, maybe you can lead us in an ending prayer and give us your blessing, and please, God, we'll have you on sometime soon.
Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God and our Mother, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
Dominus sit.
And come to Spiritu.
Orbi tuis, et in labiis tuis, in nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen.
God bless, Father. Thank you.
Thank you.